This is your boy DC, the brain supreme of tag team, and you're listening to the business side of music.
Hey, this is Jack Sharkey, host
There
of
it
Between the
is.
Notes. Take a break from all the turmoil in the world and join us each week as we explore the magic, mystery, and beauty of music.
One thing that did
Between the
happen
Notes,
during
a
the 60s
podcast
was
dedicated
some
to everything
music of
music,
an unusual
available
experimental
everywhere
nature
you
did
get your
recorded and
podcasts.
did get released. Now look at who the executives were in those companies at those times. Not hip young guys. These were cigar-chomping old guys who looked at the product that came and said, I don't know. Who knows what it is? Record it, stick it out. If it sells, all right. We were better off with those guys than we are now with the supposedly hip young executives who are making the decisions of what people should see and hear in the marketplace.
Success in the music business begins with a dream, a vision. This podcast will give you, the listener, the insight and tools to turn that vision into a reality. Meet the industry professionals who work day by day behind the scenes, helping to make those dreams come true. Welcome to the business side of music.
In the studio here in Nashville, Tennessee, sitting across the podcast table from us today is Paula Blackman. Now, this is interesting. I actually caught your interview. I think it was on Fox 17 here in town one morning. Eric Dahl. Yeah.
Rock and Review.
Yeah. And he brought up this book, Night Train to Nashville, the greatest untold story of Music City. And as I started researching it, I went, okay, we have to get Paula on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. Now, quickly, when I did a little bit of research on you, you're actually a retired gemologist.
I am, yes.
And authoring was not your primary source back then.
Exactly. You know, I was not a professional writer, not a professional historian, not a professional journalist, but I was raised by all of the above.
Oh, were you really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that helped a little. And then when I was I sold diamonds to jewelers. And when I was in the diamond business, I had 2 robbery attempts. One, I was beaten up by Colombians while I was at a red light in Omaha after calling on the big jewelry store Warren Buffett owns. And they arrested one of those men, but the other 3 got away. And so I went to my vacation home in Florida and stayed. And I was in Florida for about 18 months, and I was slipped a horse tranquilizer.
Oh, my gosh.
Locked into the trunk of a rental car.
Oh, my gosh.
And so, as you can imagine, I was diagnosed with PTSD.
Right.
And when I had PTSD, the therapist that was treating me said, you know, Paula, it would probably help us because when I was slipped the horse tranquilizer and in that trunk of the rental car, I lost 5 hours of my life. I had no recollection whatsoever of those 5 hours. So the therapist said, start writing down things you remember. And I wrote those down, and believe it or not, there was a famous author working out in the gym that I belonged to, and he shared a trainer with my daughter. His name was Stephen King.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And this is what happens in Florida. And so he invited me to a writers group at the club, and in that group was a guy named Leslie Waller. And Leslie Waller wrote Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He wrote Dog Day Afternoon, Hide in Plain Sight. And he was originally going to take this story of me in the diamond business and the things that happened to me there and write them. But when he started looking at all the pages that I had written for the therapist, he said, my God, girl, you don't need to have me write the book. You can write it yourself.
With no previous experience whatsoever.
Other than editing my mother's newspaper columns. She was a reporter, a journalist, a columnist, managing editor of newspapers. And so I kind of picked that up without even realizing I had picked it up. So I knew how to write, even though I had never, been really trained to write. Right. And I knew how to do research as a journalist, even though I wasn't a journalist because my mother was one. So I just happened to be, I think, in all the right places at all the right times to be able to write this book.
Well, so let's start going down those tracks.
Yes.
Night Train to Nashville. Obviously, you're 6th generation Nashvilleian.
Yes.
And you do spend part of your time living in Southwest Florida.
Right.
God bless you. What was the nucleus to write this book? What was driving you to put words to paper?
You know, I had always wanted to tell this story. I kind of thought my mother would write it because my mother was the journalist. And this was a story that wasn't well known in Nashville. But you know, the funny thing about my mother, she was born and raised here in Nashville. And, you know, she went to Nashville schools. And she used to call Nashville the Who's Your Daddy town. Everything that you could expect to happen in your life, in her opinion, was all dependent on who was your daddy. And now understand, she was born in 36, so we're talking about in the 40s, 50s, early 60s. Nashville was a completely different town.
But it was still who you know or who you know.
It was.
Yeah.
And it was much smaller then,
and that
too.
obviously hasn't changed much.
No, it hasn't.
In the last 60, 70 years.
You're exactly right. So I kind of always thought my mother would write this story. And I always had it in the back of my mind. Well, after having this experience with writing the story of, all these experiences in the diamond business, that Leslie Waller sent that manuscript to an agent in New York who sent it to an agent in Hollywood, and I sold that story to Hollywood. Hollywood sent me to a professional screenwriting school to actually learn how to write a script. And when I got into that school, they said, okay, everybody's got to have a class project. And so this book started as my class project in the Writers Boot Camp Screenwriting School in Santa Monica, California. It started as a screenplay. And I sold it to Hollywood once to be made into a movie, once to be made into a series, but I sold it just from like outlines and pretty amateurish script. So those didn't get made. And then when COVID came, by that time it had been picked up by Sony. It had a writer attached. The writer was Gregory Allen Howard. He's most famous for having written Remember the Titans. In fact, when I went into Sony to pitch this story to them, I walked in and said, this is Remember the Titans set in the world of early R&B. So if you remember the movie Remember the Titans, some people, you ask most people what the movie is about, and they will tell you it's about football. Well, that's not what it's really about. The heart of the story is about racism and integration. The heart of Night Train to Nashville, the underlying, moral tale is about racism and integration.
But let's back up a little bit because Nashville has always been a country music town. But there was this underlying R&B, rock and roll flavor, too, that really hadn't risen its head, right?
Well, I would kind of, in many respects, disagree with you about Nashville always being country music. Now, I'm going way back. So if we go way back, all the way back to the time of Queen Victoria, right after the Civil War, when Fisk University was created, there were the Fisk University gospel singers that were known as the Jubilee Singers, and they went to Europe and they performed for Queen Victoria. And that was originally where the name Music City came from. It came from that performance in London to Queen Victoria by the African American gospel singers at Fisk University. Now, this preceded country music. Country music really, in my opinion, it kind of came out of the hillbilly music, and that became prevalent in Nashville through the Grand Ole Opry and the WSM broadcast. That was years after the Jubilee Singers. So you could almost say Music City started with gospel, and then it morphed and evolved into hillbilly music, which morphed and evolved into country music, which then when you combined gospel and hillbilly and country and then the blues, which was always present around that African American section of Nashville, which was, say, bordered on the south by Charlotte Avenue and the north by Jefferson Street. There were always blues artists performing there. And so when you put all that music together, you end up with rock and roll. So country music is what Nashville is known for, and people identify Nashville as country music city. And Nashville identifies itself as country music city. But the music roots are much deeper and much more significant in that they started with gospel. So it's what you are referring to is a more recent alliteration of Nashville. I'm going all the way back.
When we talk about that time, especially the 50s and the 60s, the cultural, the social, the integration revolution was really just starting to take hold.
Right. Actually, my book opens with the Columbia race riots in 1946.
Okay.
And historians will tell you today, it wasn't thought of this way at the time, but the historians will tell you that that is the opening salvo in the civil rights movement. And that happened over a radio.
So explain that a little further if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So what happened was there was an African-American man who was in the Navy. His name was James Stevenson, and his mother's name was Gladys Stevenson, and they lived in Columbia, which, if you're not from Tennessee, that's a suburb of Nashville about 30 minutes from downtown. So they are living in Columbia, Tennessee, and James Stevenson is away in the Navy, and he's, interestingly enough, a radio technician, a radio repairman. And he has a radio at home, and he asks his mother when he's on his way home to take his radio into Castronauts Service Center in Columbia and get his radio repaired. And so Gladys Stevenson takes James's radio into Castronauts to get the radio repaired. Now, this is 1946, and you can't get tires, you can't get cars, you can't get radios, you can't get refrigerators. All the manufacturers had converted their manufacturing centers into the war effort. So everything that was being manufactured in the United States was being done for the war effort. So there's basically no goods and services to be found. And radios are commanding a premium. Well, Castronauts had stamped on the back of their claim tickets that if you leave your merchandise for over 30 days, they have the right to confiscate it. Now, Castronauts never did that, but in this particular instance, the radio repairman inside the Castronauts Service Center in Columbia on the 31st day confiscated that radio and sold it to one of his relatives because you couldn't get them otherwise. So James Stevenson and his mother Gladys come to pick up that radio, and it's confronted with the information that, we sold it. And he's understandably upset. You sold my radio. It was my radio. What gave you the right to sell it? Well, you didn't pick it up within 30 days. And James Stevenson started to argue with the clerk, and so the clerk at Castronauts turned around and hit him in the face, punched him. And so James Stevenson picked up the clerk after he punched him in the face and threw him through the plate glass window of the Castronauts, and the clerk lands on the sidewalk. Obviously, the police are called, and James Stevenson and his mother Gladys are taken to jail, and they're arrested. Okay, the clerk inside Castronauts who originally punched him and who stole the radio, okay, he was not arrested, okay? But James Stevenson and his mother Gladys were put in jail. Now, the interesting thing about Columbia is, for those who aren't, historians, that's very, very close to the birthplace of the KKK. And it was a place where there were a lot of lynchings. And the African-American people in Columbia believed that James Stevenson was going to be lynched. And so they fought back. The National Guard was called in. there were machine guns on the corners, on the street corners in Columbia. 100 African Americans were arrested for protesting, basically to protect James Stevenson from being lynched. Now, how this relates to my story, I know I've taken a very long, winding road to get there. That's kind of what Southern storytellers do, is my grandfather, his name was Gab Blackman. He was the advertising manager of the Nashville Banner, and he had come there from Casternauts. Casternauts was his biggest, best client. He hears about all of this as it's happening at Casternauts, and he takes the story to James Stallman, the owner of the Nashville Banner newspaper, for them to send reporters out there to cover it. And they cover it, not accurately, I might add, but one of the things that stuck with my grandfather that he's never forgotten, and I'm going to have to be careful about how I phrase this because I can't really say the words that they said, but what the clerk at Casternauts said, what does a blank need a radio for anyway? None of their devil's music is played on the air. Now, my grandfather hears this comment and he thinks, what? The term R&B didn't exist then. The term was race music. There's no race music played anywhere on the air. And as he investigated it, it turned out that was 100% true. There was not a single radio station of any significant reach that was playing any what was then considered taboo race music, what we would now call today R&B or the blues. It wasn't broadcast anywhere. It was considered too low class and dirty for the airwaves. And yet, the African American population in the southern United States was a significant amount of people. So you've got this huge population, but none of the music that they want to hear is being broadcast. And my grandfather, you can call him a lot of things. One thing you can say is he was an opportunist. You make a comment like that to an opportunist who is in the advertising business, he sees something that nobody else saw. And to quote Bill Hoss Allen, really famous man around here, Bill Allen was a DJ who went by Hoss Allen on air, said, we had this guy nobody ever talks about, and his name was E.G. Blackman, and he was the first person in this country to recognize the value in that music and in that audience. And that's how that whole R&B genre got started here in Nashville in 1946.
We're going to take a break, get a word in for a couple of our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to have some more very interesting conversation with Paula Blackman, the author of Night Train to Nashville, the greatest untold story of Music City.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Hi, everyone. I'm Larry Butler, and I want to send you a free digital copy of my new book, The Singer-Songwriter Rulebook, 101 Ways to Help You Improve Your Chances of Success. That's right. Everything you need to know to launch your career as a singer-songwriter, all based on my 40 years in the live performance arena, and believe me, I've seen it all. In my book, you'll find the 10 things you have to deal with before even thinking about becoming a singer-songwriter performer. You'll also learn about the 5 things every singer-songwriter can do this weekend to make their live show better. 5 things I can guarantee that you are not doing already. Plus, there's tips on songwriting and staging, photo and video shoots, publishing, merch, dozens of other topics, all written for people who don't particularly like to read. And again, it's free. Just go to the Business Side of Music website homepage and look for my book cover. Click on it, and a free digital copy of my book will be yours. I'm Larry Butler, and I approve of this message. Thanks.
Since 1963, Korg has been creating new experiences in music and performance. That is what drove the creation of some of Korg's most legendary products, such as the Poly 6, the M1, King, the Electribe, the Triton, the Minilogue, the Kronos, Wave State, Op6, and most recently the Nautilus, which is what we have here in our studio. Korg is dedicated to creating new, innovative, and uncompromising instruments which maintain the highest quality to inspire music makers, past, present, and future. Visit Korg.com or your favorite Korg dealer to get your hands on one of their products and start creating new music always. Korg, the official sponsor of the business side of music.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Back in the studio, Paula Blackman is sitting across the podcast table, the author of Night Train to Nashville, the greatest untold story of Music City. Obviously, I learned a lot about Music City not being Music City as we consider. And of course, so many things have changed in this town.
Oh my gosh.
Over the years. My wife is a more recent transplant than I am. She's a California girl too. She never got to see Music Row. Like I got to see Music Row back in the 80s and the 90s. Never got to see Demumbrian the way it was laid out. In fact, you didn't go downtown to Lower Broadway back in those days.
You absolutely did not. That was dangerous.
It was a great place to get mugged.
That's right.
Well, you went to the Honky Tonks or maybe the Ryman, but...
That's right.
Yeah, now it's just this gigantic tourist trap,
exactly.
per se.
Well, let me go back to talking about the R&B roots in Nashville because...
Yeah, because I want to touch a little bit on radio and how that really kind of fomented.
Exactly. So... What Gab Blackman, my grandfather, what he did was he took this information about there's no race music played anywhere, that's what they called it then, trying to use the vernacular of the time to get it historically correct.
Sure.
There was no race music of the time
and
being
there's
played.
No reason to pretend that didn't exist.
Right.
And I think that's where in the world, and especially in this country, we have a problem because we're trying to correct a lot of things.
Exactly.
And we can't learn from history if we bury that in the ground.
That is the reason
and I don't get political on the show. I do not get political on the show.
Well, that's the very reason I wrote the book, because this, when we say it's the greatest untold story of Music City, that's because every single person who reads the book or who hears the book said, I've lived in Nashville my whole life and I had no idea.
Right.
So that's the universal response when people read the book. But what happened was he went to...
And this is your grandfather you're talking about.
Yes, Gab Blackman. So after he hears this comment, he goes to J. Truman Ward, who was at the time the owner of WLAC Radio. This is 1946. And he goes in there and he has this idea of how they can own the nighttime air, because Nashville, it's got a strange atmospherics. WLAC had a 50,000 watt signal, but the way and the placement, the way that the atmospheric conditions are above Nashville and the placement of that 50,000 watt tower, they have now determined that it was actually going out at about 100,000 watts. It reached Canada, it reached the Caribbean, it went over the entire eastern half of the United States, which my grandfather had calculated was where, and I'm going to use the vernacular of the time, 80% of the colored population in the United States lived. So he was like, wow. That's what Hoss Allen meant by this great untapped audience. This was 80% of the African Americans in the United States lived east of the Mississippi River, and their signal reached from Canada to the Caribbean east of the Mississippi River. So he knew he had this captive audience. And also, there was basically no business occurring after 11 o'clock, midnight or so on WLAC. I mean, they were just giving away commercials they'd sold during the day because they couldn't sell anything because nobody was listening. So he made a deal with Truman Ward and said, hey, look, if you let me take over the nighttime air and give me a percentage of all the new business I bring in, I can make you enough money that you can afford to get into the television business, which was what J. Truman Ward and Blackie, that was my grandfather's nickname, really wanted to do. Because the other thing that happened at the time of the Columbia race riots was the FCC announced that they were going to open up television licenses. And television had been invented. There were stations in New York and
but we're
Chicago.
Talking 1940s.
There wasn't television anywhere in the middle of the United States.
Right, correct.
So the FCC announced they were going to issue 20 television licenses, and the smallest city on the list, number 20, the last city to get its license, was Nashville. Now they knew television was coming to Nashville, and there was this perception that television was going to kill radio. It became like, back then, transistors hadn't been invented yet. And so people listened to the radio they'd have these big wooden boxes that would be closer to a television now in its size, but they had these big wooden boxes, and the whole family would gather around at night and listen to radio. And the perception was, what's going to happen when we got these big wooden boxes and we're listening to the same programs, but they got pictures with it. We can see, not just hear. Who's going to want to hear and not see? So the radio men were in a bit of a panic, thinking that they were going to lose all their business. Now, WLAC was third in a 3-station market here in Nashville, but they had this tremendous reach. And so Gab Blackman invited 2 caddies that he knew from the Woodmont Country Club here in Nashville, and he brought them up to the top floor of the 3rd National Bank building, which was where WLAC was located, at 4th and Charlotte, which is, right up the street from the Ryman. And he took these 2 caddies in with some of their records and said to the on-air announcer, his name was Gene Nobles, hey, would you play this guy's music? And so Gene Nobles in 1946 played this music, and all of a sudden the floodgates opened. This music had never been heard before on the airwaves. It had been only heard in black nightclubs and on jukeboxes, the jukeboxes in places where African Americans frequented. And so this was the first time that the national airwaves were broadcasting this kind of music. I mean, it hit the country like a hurricane. And all of a sudden, letters were coming in from everywhere asking the station to play more of that music. So WLAC, instead of selling ads and airtime at night, they started selling record packages and other products that appealed to their listening audience, and a thing that was called per inquiry. So the station got a percentage of what was sold on air. It became the most successful radio show in history at the time. They had 15 million people tuning in nightly to a radio station that had nobody listening 2 weeks before.
Well, and times back then were so different, and you bring up television. We didn't look at television back then like we do today. Television now is more kind of a distraction for us.
Right.
You didn't get the whole family gathering around the TV set or the radio that you did then. But I think at the same time, it also created a new environment that people hadn't thought about before. And when you put, let's just call it R&B music, you call it race music, but when you start putting that on the free airwaves, you're now reaching not just a black audience, but you're also reaching a white audience that may not have known any different or any better.
Exactly. And can I go to the point in history where it was no longer called race music and began to be called R&B?
Yeah.
I'd like to address that because if you type into the Google machine, who created the term R&B, it's going to pop up that Jerry Wexler did. He was a reporter for Billboard magazine.
Right.
But the truth is, this broadcast was so popular, and Gene Nobles was doing this for like 3 hours a night, and it was wearing him out. And the records by mail order started on this radio station. They were also selling baby chicks through the mail. They were selling any kind of product, mufflers, razors, socks, anything that they thought their listening audience might want. But my grandfather had more and more record retailers wanting to buy time or get their per inquiries put on there. So he gets his news announcer. The guy's name was John Richburg. He went by John R. And so my grandfather gives John R. an hour of Gene Noble's 3 hours, and John R. starts his show. And so when you have a radio show, you need to they have a theme song, they have an identity that what we now call DJs, they were then called announcers. They have their, log lines. And John R. signs on, and I believe it was May of 1948, and he signs on with the expression, "This is old John R. coming at you with 50,000 watts of power from way down south in Dixie, Nashville, Tennessee, 1510 on your dial, and I'm going to play you some R&B. I'm going to play you some rhythm and blues." And the theme song was, "Come on, John R., play us some rhythm and blues." Now, like I said, this is the R&B station in the country. It's really the only R&B station.
So it really started here.
100% it started here. And so John R. is on air in May saying, I'm going to play you some rhythm and blues. Now, Jerry Wexler over at Billboard magazine, they're reporting, I can't remember what they called it, but they called it something else, like Sepia Records or something. He hears John R. on the air calling this R&B, so he changes that category from whatever it was he called it at the time to rhythm and blues, R&B, and then he took the credit for coming up with that terminology because he was the first person to put it in writing. He changed that category on Billboard magazine's top charts from whatever it was before. But that comes 2.5 months after John R. has been using this log line on WLAC. Now, I can also tell you that John R. and then the other DJ that came behind him, Hoss Allen, they really presided over the development of that particular genre, because if you wanted to get a record deal or you wanted to sell some records and those records were R&B or the blues, there was only one place in the country to go. You can have, Little Richard will tell you that, James Brown will tell you that. You read in their autobiographies, they will be telling you, well, we didn't know what we were going to play, but we knew it had to be played on WLAC because that was the only place they could get the exposure. Now, today, a record producer, an artist would walk into a radio station with an already produced record. But back then, they went in first live, and then they went in with dubs and demos. And if WLAC played your dub or demo, then the record producers would press the record, because then they knew the audience was out there, and then turn around, WLAC would sell it. WLAC started their own they were recording the records in their own studio. So they were discovering the talent, launching the talent, pressing the records, and then selling the records. And that really created R&B. Now, there's one other thing that I would like to say about this, and that is that this was Music City because there was a corner. It's now where the Municipal Auditorium is, and that's a significant storyline in the book. But there's a corner, 4th and Charlotte. And at the corner of 4th and Charlotte is the premier black nightclub, and it's called the New Era Club. New Era Club sits at the corner of 4th and Charlotte. Directly across the street from the New Era Club is the Colored YMCA. So all these wannabe musicians, including Little Richard, including B.B. King, including James Brown, they do whatever they can, mostly ride the night trains, into Nashville so that they can try and get to WLAC to get their records played, so they can get their demos played, so they can get a record deal. So they check into the Colored YMCA, they walk across the street to the New Era Club, They begged the owner, Sue Bridgeforth, to let them perform at the New Era Club, because guess who's sitting in the New Era Club at night? The only white guys. There was only really one, Hoss Allen, but John R. came sometimes. The white DJs would come to the New Era Club, hide in the back to listen to the talent so they'd know whether they were going to bring them down to WLAC and put them on air, or Sue Bridgeforth, the owner of the New Era Club, would call down to WLAC and say, hey, got somebody you need to hear. And so that's where the Night Train to Nashville title comes from. All these wannabe musicians who would hitchhike, take the night trains, do whatever they could to come to Nashville, stay at the Colored YMCA, walk across the street to be discovered at the New Era Club, then walk 3 blocks south, same street, 4th Avenue North, to the Third National Bank building, where during the day it's all these like blue-haired ladies, wealthy Nashvillians coming in there to deposit their money into their, little passbook savings account. At night, on the 13th floor, they were rocking with this crazy-ass R&B music that was blanketing the entire eastern half of the United States. So R&B originated right here in Nashville, within probably 100 yards of the Ryman. Now, why R&B left and the Ryman became prevalent, well, that's a whole nother storyline that you should probably read in the book.
We're going to take another break, get another couple words in for our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little more with Paula Blackman about this book, Night Train to Nashville.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Whether you consider yourself a musician or not, music is all around us, and it affects our everyday lives, whether it's background music influencing our shopping habits in a store, organ music adding the vibe to a baseball game, or a playlist convincing us to keep going on that last mile of a run. I'm Mindy Peterson, host of the podcast Enhance Life with Music, where we take a holistic look at music's benefits through the lens of science and medicine, entertainment, and business. You can find me and Enhance Life with Music at mpetersonmusic.com/podcast or wherever you get your audio.
Hey, this is Jack Sharkey, host of Between the Notes. Take a break from all the turmoil in the world and join us each week as we explore the magic, mystery, and beauty of music. Between the Notes, a podcast dedicated to everything music, available everywhere you get your podcasts.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Back in the studio, Paula Blackman sitting across the table. She is the author of Night Train to Nashville. You and I seem to have as interesting conversations off the air,
yeah.
And that happens a lot on this show as we do on the air. But we seem to forget that it was a different world back then. It was a different day.
Completely.
You had a different seating area for blacks
That's
than you
right.
did whites. Water fountains were the same way. Bathrooms.
Exactly.
And it wasn't a good time. And my wife and I had this conversation yesterday, in fact, that back in the 50s and the early 60s, there was a certain amount of innocence in this country. But at the same time, the blinders were on. What you didn't want to see, you didn't see. And it wasn't just the South. South was really kind of has the moniker for the segregation issue, but you still dealt with this in other parts of the country.
That's a really great point. And I'm going to tell you something that I have never told publicly, and I had originally put it in the book, and then when HarperCollins needed me to get the word count down, I took it out. But when I was a child in Nashville, and this was actually a few years after Nashville officially integrated, it was that when I told you there was that part of Nashville that was between Charlotte and Jefferson Street, and it was a pretty kind of slummy area. Most of the homes there, right behind Capitol Hill, they had outhouses. They didn't have running water. They didn't have electricity. And my parents or my grandparents, whomever I was with when One of my grandfathers was a physician, and he was on the other side of that area. And so when I would go from...
That is literally the other side of the tracks.
Right.
Yeah.
So when I would go from WLAC offices at 4th and Church, and then we'd cross through that part to go to Buchanan, where my other grandfather had his medical office, my parents or my grandparents would tell my younger brother, Brett, and I that we had to get down in the wheel well. So as we approached Charlotte, we had to get down on the floorboards. We were not allowed to sit up on the seats of the car when we went through the colored part of town. And they didn't explain to us why we weren't allowed to be up there. So why we couldn't see, we had to go down where we couldn't see or be seen.
Right.
And so there was kind of this perception that, that was a dangerous part of town, like we couldn't be seen in that part of town. But later, when one night my mother had to drive my African-American nanny home, she came to me quietly and said, "Paula, this time when we get to that part of town," we knew exactly where it was. We had been trained that we had to get down on the floorboard when we hit that part of town. Don't get on the floor. Sit up there because we don't want to hurt Aggie's feelings. And I was like, wow, I didn't understand that at all. So I'm sitting in there. I don't know that my brother was with me, but I'm sitting in there and we hit that part of town. I had never seen it before. And I was under the impression that everybody in Nashville lived just like we did, that everybody in Nashville had running water, everybody in Nashville had electricity, everybody in Nashville had, bathrooms.
Sure.
But when I found out that this nanny, this woman that took care of me every single day, didn't have running water in her house, didn't have electricity, didn't have screens on her windows, Aggie got out. I cried all the way home. I was devastated.
Would we say that was a life-changing moment for you?
It's probably the reason I wrote that book.
Wow.
And it's the reason I wrote that book the way I wrote it. Because today, people just don't want to acknowledge that this is what this was like here.
Yeah.
It's like they have amnesia. Nashville today is not the city it was then. And it was only then that I realized it wasn't that my parents were afraid that something, would happen to us, like it was a dangerous part. No, they did not want us to know that that part of town even existed. And they didn't want us to know that this woman that we loved, that cared for us, lived under those conditions. Now, my name is on this book, but I have to tell you, I really didn't write it completely myself. There are two protagonists. There's my grandfather, the white radio executive, and then there's the African-American man who owned the New Era Club. His name was Sue Bridgeforth. Now, Sue Bridgeforth's daughter, Harriet, helped me with all the chapters in the book that take place in the New Era and that, involve her parents. And her experience was similar but completely different in that Harriet lived in an affluent section. She lived in what was called Black Bell Mead. Her parents were wealthy. She didn't know that segregation existed until she went at 10 or 11 years old to a drugstore and sat down at the counter and tried to order a cheeseburger, and they refused to serve it to her because of the color of her skin. She had no idea that she wasn't allowed to order a cheeseburger in a public place because she was black. And so her mother comes running up and she's like, the lady behind the counter says, "We don't serve coloreds." And Harriet's like, "What does my skin color have to do with the fact I want to eat a cheeseburger?" And then her mother comes and says, some places don't serve coloreds. And Harriet says, "And you're just telling me this now?" So her, both sets of our parents were trying to protect us from what was really a very ugly truth.
Let's talk about some of the characters that are in this book. You mentioned Little Richard, you mentioned B.B. King. Who else can we expect to see as we peruse the pages?
Etta James, James Brown.
And these are all people
Aretha Franklin.
They all played in Nashville.
They all played at the New Era Club. Little Richard was playing here by the time he was 14. And when he originally played here, Sue Bridgeforth thought he was a woman because that was part of his act. He came in, at 14.
Well, he was very flamboyant.
And he had makeup and he dressed in a a uniform that kind of looked like the Canadian Mounties, but before that, he dressed in a red dress because that was just his, and also who played in the New Era was Jackie Shane, and that was a first real transvestite entertainer. Jackie Shane went to Canada because of the way she was treated here. A lot of the musicians left Nashville for the very reason we just talked about. And in its place came country music. So what you see when we started this program, you talked about Broadway and, all the clubs on Broadway. Well, that existed here as early as the mid to late 40s and early 50s, but it wasn't country. They weren't honky-tonks. They were the black nightclubs on Jefferson Street. And in the story, I cover what happened to all those nightclubs and why they're no longer here. But had they been allowed to stay, you would have had a section of R&B that would resemble what Broadway is today for country. And Nashville would be so much better if that music was still here. And I'm hoping we can bring it back.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about how people can get the book.
Oh, well, it's sold everywhere in Barnes & Noble.
Can we get it on your website?
Amazon. I don't know if it's hooked up on the website quite yet, but you can.
Your assistant's shaking her head. So.
Let me tell you what I think is the best way to get the book. I would get the audiobook because I remember I told you that John R. created this R&B that Wexler took the credit for. John R. had a very specific voice that pretty much anybody who listened to that broadcast would recognize. And when HarperCollins sent me audition tapes for who was going to read the audiobook, I'm like, no. I need a voice that sounds exactly like one of those two DJs, Hoss Allen or John R. And we were having trouble finding one. And then John R.'s stepson called me and said, hey, Paula, my brother, Matt, can sound exactly like my dad. So John R.'s son, I read the prologue and the epilogue because they are written in first person, but the balance of the book is read by John R.'s son, Matt Richburg, who sounds just like him. And if you get on Spotify, there is a playlist, the Night Train to Nashville playlist, that accompanies the book. So if you listen to John R. or John R.'s voice, Matt Richburg, imitating it, and you listen to the music on the Spotify playlist, it's almost like you're back in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. And ultimately, what I hoped to establish when I wrote this book was that I could prove Beethoven's premise that music has the ability to change the world. And some of the reviewers, particularly the reviewer at the Christian Science Monitor, said that my book proves just that. And the reason is, and you'll have to read about this in the book, but it was not a coincidence that Music City became the first Southern city to desegregate, because music brought people together. You mentioned that white teens particularly were tuning in to this black music program. It was that program that brought white teens and black teens together. And Tennessee State University, that was then called Tennessee A&I, in 1956, so this broadcast has now been on the air for 10 years, Tennessee State University's Student Council put on a concert. Little Richard was there. I think B.B. King was there. Maybe not. Fats Domino was there. All these, big R&B stars come into town to play the Tennessee State campus, then called Tennessee A&I. And the Student Council sent an invitation to all the white colleges, including Vanderbilt, including Belmont, and said, come to our concert. The white college students came to this historically black college, and everybody got along. They danced together. They enjoyed the music together. And that is one of the reasons why James Lawson and Martin Luther King moved to their student protest, whatever, I forget what they call it, workshops to right outside the Tennessee State campus. And it was through that connection that Nashville then, 4 years later, becomes the first Southern city to desegregate. It started on the TSU campus with the first integrated concert in the South.
I look forward to reading this book. It's going to be quite a journey, I'm sure.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me, for letting me share this story. I put 15 years worth of research into it.
Oh, and you can tell by just perusing through it as little as I have so far. It's definitely been a work of love for you, I can tell.
It has been.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for letting me tell it.
Here's a shout out to our loyal listeners. Without all of you, we wouldn't be one of the most listened to music interview podcast shows, including achieving #1 status in many countries around the world, according to the almighty and powerful Apple Podcasts. If you enjoy our show, please check out our Facebook page at the Business Side of Music Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and definitely hit the like button. We always appreciate that. While you're at it, go to our page on YouTube and click on the Business Side of Music Podcast to subscribe. You can check out our video webcast there and get to see me and our guests, such as Paula, sitting across the table today here in the studio, along with Buddy the Music Dog, who occasionally makes his entrance and exit. We didn't get to see him today because his mother's got him locked up in the bedroom. Last but not least, check us out and follow us on Twitter. I guess we call it X these days. I'm old school. You can find us there at Biz Music Podcast. That's BIZMUSIC Podcast. Paula, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Business Side of Music is the creation of Tom Sabella and Tracy Snow and is produced by Bob Bender. The Business Side of Music is recorded at Music Dog Studios in Nashville, Tennessee. Production sound designed by Keith Stark. Voiceover and promo by Lisa Fuson.